It's interesting for me to come from commercial level cannabis production, large scale cannabis production, indoor production systems, and get to be able to once again talk about my true background, which is the use of indigenous microorganisms in agriculture systems. Hi everybody, I'm James Rushing, and I was invited out here by the Gage Green Group because I offer comprehensive consultation services to large-scale cannabis production companies all over the world, and I have a background in natural farming analysis and experimentation with specific natural farming techniques, and I just wanted to talk a little bit today about I was deciding on my way over here on the plane. I came in from San Francisco, and how am I going to present this and what am I going to talk about? This is a really unique group, and I know that there's a lot of people that are really into what they're into out here. I have a couple cannabis companies that I work with out in Michigan, and it's a very different culture than what I'm used to in California and in Hawaii and other markets that I operate in. And it's very, very wholesome, and it's very intuitive, and it's very biologically friendly in a lot of instances, and so it's kind of my wheelhouse. And so it's interesting for me to come from commercial level cannabis production, large scale cannabis production, indoor production systems, and get to be able to once again talk about my true background, which is the use of indigenous microorganisms in agriculture systems. Okay. So I'll just kind of go a little bit of timeline about myself. I planted my first cannabis seed in 1994. I was living in Chicago and then eventually transferred out to Western Illinois to attend college. And over that period, I ended up establishing several production facilities on the black market. And it's funny, I get to be able to talk about it these days. It's very nice. And so then migrated to kind of large-scale production, as you have it, into the over 150 lights, and started to delves headfirst into the cannabis culture despite my location. And I then got a very global and worldless view of cannabis and started venturing all over the world to discover what cannabis was all about. And then I kind of brought it back home. So I'll kind of detail that through. I started breeding cannabis in 1998. I started mixing various Dutch varieties, mostly African varieties and the Swazi and African varieties, with other Northern European, we called them in the day tamed varieties, that were made for indoor production systems, and started working with those genetics over the course of 2001 through 2006. I was spending a lot of time in Holland and in the UK, learning about the emerging cannabis industry and doing a lot of breeding with legacy cannabis companies from Northern Europe and in Holland. Basically honing my techniques for breeding and cultivation, trying to really get into gene manipulation as it exists either in natural breeding or with chemicals, which was a thing to do back in the day, using high amounts of different isolated hormones and then completely changing the genetic codes in cannabis. And I know that sounds disturbing to a lot of young people, but in the end, about 3 of the original 10 strains that came out of Europe in those days were a result of those techniques. So it was done. It's still done to this day, and it was something that I wanted to watch firsthand. So I spent a lot of time out there working with those people, and this was all before we used to call it the World Wide Web, right? Where there was no transfer of information as readily, easily as it is today, and you had to be hands-on. And it was a really cool experience to spend a lot of time with the Wageningen University staff in Holland, which was really the first university that was accepting and using cannabis production and analysis, but from an ancillary perspective. They were kind of like, oh, let's look at the systems they use, or let's look at the media they use, or whatever, but still kind of like with a focus and some kind of touching on the interest of what the cannabis production was looking for. So it was a really cool experience. And then in 2007, I actually ended up transferring myself and my everything to the islands of Hawaii. I was born in Chicago. I spent a lot of time in Northern Europe. I was done with cold. So I was into the idea of getting into tropical cannabis production. And before anybody knew what THCV was, looking into THCV in tropical varieties. So at that time, I made my way over to Oahu and did a lot of outdoor cannabis production, mostly focusing on land races like Thai varieties, Colombians, and back to my Swazis, but trying to do them without them being balanced with Dutch varieties, and finding like the origins and how to bring them down to size myself with hormone manipulation and stuff like that. So it was a real cool time to mess with land races, and then eventually I took a lot of those and brought them to the Dutch varieties and California varieties that were coming up at the time. And so I got really, really into breeding, and it basically took me all over the world at that point, just kind of wrapping my whole existence around cannabis and understanding cannabis, and not getting pigeonholed into a grow, a spot, very much migratory movements all over the world for different reasons, because there were different epicenters of things happening, and then focusing on those epicenters, and then not getting married to one of them, or hooked on one culture or one set of ideals, and just kind of bouncing around and trying to figure out what is truly cannabis production at its core. Hawaii is a really great place to produce cannabis. Has anybody ever who's been to Hawaii? Nobody? That's what I love about Michigan. You guys are in Michigan. That's awesome. Hawaii is a beautiful place, but it's just like any other place. It's like you see on Dog the Bounty Hunter. That's actually kind of what Hawaii is very close to. But it's also a very unique place where the ideals of the individuals there is very much a community environment, and there's a lot of universal understanding and brotherhood, and we call it living aloha, and it's a new kind of ideal that a lot of people, when they learn about it, are very, very hooked on it, and that's why the population of Hawaii is spiking. But I digress. It's a beautiful place to be, but it's also a great place to produce cannabis because it has a 12-12 light cycle almost the entire year. So when you talk about experimenting and being able to produce large size land races, it's a beautiful place to be able to do so. Plus the cannabis laws, since way before even California, you were able to grow 6 plants, and so there was a place for growers in that environment, but there were no retail or dispensaries at the time for a very long time in Hawaii. So it was very much dictated upon how to survive with your medicine, how to survive with your recreational tools. In Hawaii was very much focused, and still is to this day, focused on the home grow and the grower. It was integrated pest management, trial by fire. If you can imagine production in Hawaii, there is no wintering off. It doesn't get cold like this, and therefore the bugs stay alive, and they also mutate, and they do weird things. We start spraying chemicals on them because they can mutate away from those chemicals and be able to create enzymes to counteract them, and not only that, but every bug in the whole entire world has made its way there because of the ornamental plant industry. And so it's a very, very difficult place. I tell people it's the hardest place in the world to produce cannabis from an integrated pest management standpoint. It is, it's full of everything you could ever not want, right? In 2009, I started my bachelor's degree at the University of Hawaii of Tropical Plants and Soil Sciences, with a focus on agricultural techniques and indigenous techniques, so Amazonian, Japanese, Korean. I was very interested in the idea, at first, the university paying me to go all over the world to look at soil. That sounded like a pretty cool thing, but then I really got into the passion of going around and learning techniques from other cultures because in the end, as I told you, I'm a cannabis grower. And so I dove into academia very, very heavily with a focus on cannabis production as my base of knowledge and what I was building everything on, so that when the tides turned, or if I just decided to move to a different location where the tides had already turned, I would be poised and ready for cannabis as it pertained to integrated pest management, production, operational management, and production systems. So that's what I dove into. Like I said, I brought my skills from cannabis to large-scale tropical agriculture production systems. I excelled in organic production for high-margin crops like coffee and moringa and pineapple, and greenhouse veggies. Anything that cost the most money, I was into, because that's what paid the bills for a lot of the agriculture department research. So I focused a lot on that, and not only that, but coffee is just a great, awesome thing. And so I got way into Hawaiian coffee. If you look at coffee, if you know anything about the coffee plant, it has a very similar structure to cannabis, besides the fact it's a perennial versus an annual. Its structure and the bud development, and its size and its need for nutrients and for different phases of production during season, it's very similar. And so I got way into coffee a lot, and then I was a lead research assistant for an organic farm for a 150-acre research facility at the University of Hawaii, where I was in charge of implementing and facilitating and staffing and operating several research projects, which were very, they have the rigorous conditions that they have to be in order to get the results, or at least the information that they're looking for. So outdoor agriculture systems with research involved is very hard to do, and so I had to organize the operational management of that. And I got inspired to do that because I got into well, I'll get into what I got into later. We'll talk about this. At the time, I helped develop a lot of peer-reviewed research projects. So I started seeing like what happens when you start taking everything you wanted to know about cannabis or plants, and then finding money to do research and find out true data with analytical tools in an analytical laboratory, using electron microscopes and everything to do identification of microorganisms, really taking it to another level. I was tired of watching everybody in cannabis kind of going like, I think this is happening over here, this isn't happening over here. So I really wanted to get into, specifically I had a problem with isolated and colonial microorganisms as they sit on the shelf and are sold as bioinoculants, and I wanted to see if that was a real thing and if it wasn't snake oil. And I was pretty heavy into finding out if when somebody says there's a microorganism in this powder and then sits on the shelf, and when you put it in an application and then you put it out to compete with other microorganisms, what exactly is the potential of it to do what they say it's going to do? And you ask anybody in traditional agriculture, they have no idea. You ask anybody in sustainable agriculture, they have no idea. You ask anybody in cannabis, they definitely have no idea. So I wanted to get into that as much as I could. I was into enzymatic, microbial plant enzymatic relationships and phytocommunication. So I did a couple research projects on how plants communicate through enzymatic exchange. We know absolutely nothing about this science, and so even just the most rudimentary data, the fact that they have enzymes that are absorbed from other plants is new data. So I helped develop that from a new research perspective in incorporating microorganisms into the equation between two plants. I made the equation really complicated and unanswerable, but I opened the door for the possibility that you can't, or the suggestion that you can't study plants without microorganisms. Just end of sentence. Like, you can't say that when you put this thing out, or this fertilizer out, or this thing out, or use this media, that if you don't bring that into the equation, you're completely missing the ball, and you're not understanding dynamics of soil chemistry and plant enzymatic exchange and all these things that really truly dictate what plants do when they absorb and take up nutrients. I got into light intensity and regularity, and at this time I opened up a consultation service because I started to get calls from California, Colorado, Washington for cannabis production. And while I was doing my research, I was also doing consultation services for large-scale grows who are looking for ways to incorporate microorganisms, either from an integrated pest management standpoint or from a nutritive standpoint, into their systems. So this is kind of a new. It's funny that it's 10 years ago, but and cannabis hasn't really taken as big of a hold to this science yet, and so I hope it changes. Because I just flashed over and look, it says 2009 was when I was doing this, and I can't believe it was 10 years ago, and we all haven't completely dove into biology, microbiology as a focus for plant production and understanding those factors before you start wondering what you're going to do for your media or what your conditions are or what have you. Okay, so I at the time I got into I started studying operational management of high commodity indoor production and propagation systems with an emphasis on like large scale tissue culture. So basically multi-million dollar tissue culturing and plant production facilities in Asia that were set up for pharmaceutical production or some sort of commodity cut flour or something like that. So I saw this avenue that I hadn't quite delved into in cannabis, which was operating a multi-million dollar clean room facility, triple enveloped tissue culture facility, and this is 10 years before this thing ever existed. So I got in, started working with a Dr. Kang Chia from University of Hawaii, who's foremost expert on operating tissue culture facilities, and started learning, development plans and how to find funding for. She taught these groups and these individuals. They taught me how to find $10 million to build a facility, and you don't learn that in college. And so I'm just trying to inspire people to look beyond and look into other industries that are massively profitable, and just know that cannabis is going to be there, and then figure out your way into that part. And it's so much easier now in cannabis for me to go around and find $10 million to do an operation. Now that I know that this is $10 million is pennies to the guys that do these tissue cultures for pharmaceuticals and all these other things. And adapting their systems, how do they operate, how to build their facilities, but also how to turn a profit with clean plants in a multi-million dollar facility. And so at that time, I was getting into a lot of operational management, understanding business plan development for the purpose of trying to expand into cannabis at some point. And then it all happened. I ran into a thing called Korean natural farming in 2010. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Korean natural farming. Yay, I'm talking to a good group. Awesome. I knew I would. So I got exposed to this thing called Korean natural farming. And for those that don't understand what it is, I'll give you a 2-minute explanation. It's a formulated, scripted technique for the inoculation of microorganisms into soil and plant surfaces by using raw materials that are from the farm and using microorganisms that are only found on the farm. In a nutshell. Am I right there? Is that kind of... I'm just spitting out I have a different definition in here, but yeah. Okay? So I got exposed to this, and this is a new way of doing farming supposedly for the mid and large scale commercial farmer to be able to utilize indigenous microorganisms and doing cultures and producing your own. It was a wet dream. It was awesome. It was like, hey, there it is. We can now do farming and make all of our fertilizers on the farm and go get it from the ocean and do this. It was a perfect Cinderella story. So I said to myself as I was getting into my graduation period, I said, this is what I'm going to pursue next, and this is what I'm going to study, and this is... But I want to take it from a outside perspective as much as I can. But I got to say, within a few months, I drank the Kool-Aid, man. I was into this. I was like, this is the answer. I got the Bible, the book, and I got it all. And it was a real cool time in the period of Korean natural farming, because in Hawaii is the epicenter of the Western adoption of that technology. So if you've heard of Korean natural farming, it's because somebody took a class in Hawaii, and then taught it to, that guy took it to Portland and then taught it to, it all came out of there, because that's where it was easy to transition from the Korean and Japanese markets to the U.S. market. Okay, I have a definition here. I'll read it out. It's very similar to Peruvian and Japanese and Amazonian techniques, but it sounded really easy. It's a claim that a series of sustainable agriculture techniques which utilize indigenous microorganisms to dramatically affect the health of plant and soil, increasing microbiodiversity and creating a condition of mass action, or it's basically an extremely dynamic enzymatic exchange situation, rapid mineralization, resource competition, and basically creating some sort of trophic dynamic. It's a soil food web in a nutshell. Trying to take an environment that has no soil food web, and then putting these materials on, and then utilizing them, and then all of a sudden they're going to be having the soil food web action going, and it's going to be simulating forest floor dynamics. Okay. In Hawaii, we say use what get, which means like you use what you have. If you have manure, you make a natural farming thing out of that, and if you have alfalfa grass, you can make a natural thing, but don't use anything that's outside of your farm. And then if you want to trade, the trade dynamic for materials is kind of okay. There's a whole religion of I don't want to call it the C word, okay? But it's these guys out there, they're into it. And so I was in it too, and I was out doing education programs and teaching people how to utilize these materials. But at the same time, like an FBI agent, I'm in there doing analytical studies on how many microorganisms are in the environment when we start and when we finish, what's the chemical makeup and NPK of these materials, what is the how much CO2 do the microorganisms expel when they're in certain states, to understand how much activity is going on in this environment. So I found a soil microbiologist who is the foremost expert on vermicompost, and I'll go ahead and drop his name. His name is Norman Aaronkhan. If you want to know anything about vermicompost, you ask him. He's at University of Hawaii, very easy to find. I found him, and I said I wanted to do a 4-year research project on Korean natural farming, and he reluctantly said yes. Good luck finding some funding. So because I was in the cannabis industry, it was a little bit easier for me to find myself funding to do this project on my own dime without the influence of anyone else. And so I did a 4-year master's degree with 3 chapters and finished it with my own money so that I can say what I wanted to say without influence from Monsanto Pioneer, Syngenta, who owned my department at the time. Because they were the largest donors. And so it was very difficult in politics. It's a very, very unique thing over there in Hawaii, so I decided I was going to fund it myself. I spent years researching like the recommended formulations and how to source the materials, their microbiodiversity and their chemical and physical properties. How do these materials affect plant chemistry and soil dynamics? How are they used in application? This is an important one. How do people interpret the recommendations? Is there a standard within the claims that this group was making? I wanted to see if you could use these materials in large scale, medium and large scale commercial production of crops, mainly because I wanted to see if there was a future of formulating any of this for cannabis use and bottling it and seeing if I could take that route with this whole thing. And of course, it's all rooted in the fact that it's all indigenous microorganisms. So in the fact that the only thing you'd be doing is selling a formulation, which is what these people are doing in the first place. And so I I took a step back and said, is there an application for this in field application for commercial production, and kind of ended there. Can you store it? What's the variability of the materials in Korean natural farming? I spent a lot of time with the culture and the leaders of the groups. These are individuals. Has anybody seen a Korean natural farming event, like in locally? No, advertised. Advertised. Okay, they're coming.
There was a regenerative cannabis growing conference, and
Yeah.
Chris Trump spoke. That was like 9 months ago, or March or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm into the ideals. Like I said, I bought into the whole thing, but I wanted to see if it was a real thing. And so I wanted to meet the leaders, Cho and group, these individuals who were marketing these books. And then I started looking at the money-making opportunities that they were making for themselves in doing lectures, and then eventually trips to Korea, to bring people to Korea to check out these events and all that. So I wanted to look at the social dynamic there and really understand who the leaders were and what their motivations were. So I eventually started this in 2014. This is titled James Rushing, Indigenous Microorganism 4, IMO4 as a Soil Inoculant. It's also a review of most inoculants that use indigenous microorganisms in methodologies and recommendations. And that was a long process of producing these materials in controlled outdoor agriculture environments, and then bringing those analysis to the laboratory. Bring those materials to the laboratory for analysis, and then kind of dissecting what all that meant in replication. I had to make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of piles of IMO4. If anybody wants me to make another pile of IMO4, you're gonna have to pay me $500,000. I do not want to make another pile of IMO4. It was so many. So I wanted to look at what was the plant response to IMO4. Does anybody know what IMO4 is? I'm working right now. IMO4 is taking indigenous microorganisms from certain areas in your farm and culturing them on a large scale in a form of compost with suggested, formulated raw materials. And then you add these materials at specific times to get a fermented, highly fermented, aerobically fermented, highly rich in fungi and bacteria, this material which then you would take to the field and put beneath your plants and incorporate into your media. And what you're essentially doing is you're trying to say that I have these saprophytic decomposing microorganisms out here, and I'm going to take them from here and make them onto this large thing, and then I'm going to put this in there, and all of a sudden this environment's going to turn into that environment. So there's a whole culture of people that were all about this, and they're making and spending their savings. These are people that living on, farm subsidies and these things that they're living day to day, living off the land, and they're spending their money on these materials. So very quickly, I wanted to understand the applicability of this specific material, because it dominated this appreciation for this idea. So people would learn about IMO4, this magic compost, and then they thought this was the cure-all be-all. You could put it in water form and spray it on your plants. You put it beneath your plants. It was just biodiversity at its finest, without an understanding of what was in it. So I started looking at microbial activity, the nutritive qualities and the physical properties of this compost, in addition to the plant response. What's in it? Who's doing what? How is it effective? The experiments I did was I applied IMO4 in application, and then I also sterilized the IMO4 to see if there was a biological, reaction to the material. Was the reaction that people saw in the increased growth of the plant, was that because I was putting microorganisms at the base, or was it because I'm putting organic matter at the base, essentially? So I did that. I did an experiment on sterilized material and its effect on plant production, and then I analyzed IMO4 itself for microbial activity and its chemical properties. People claiming it's rich in biodiversity and hundreds of microorganisms. So I wanted to find out what was in this material. My conclusions very quickly. There were very few significant changes in all factors. Sorry. The Cinderella dream was, at least in my experience of 4 years of studying, not only IMO4, but pretty much everything has to do with Korean natural farming. I found that it had very few significant changes, and you can read about it. I'll tell you how to Google the publication. It's basically when applied in, and this is why, when applied in field application or in controlled settings, IMO4, or pretty much any biodiverse, rich compost, right? Consisting of nurtured microorganisms that you've babied and given specific concentrations of sugars or nutritive aspects. It was no more effective to plant health and soil plant microbial populations or soil chemistry or soil physical properties than the addition of compost. Okay. Microorganisms in IMO4 cannot compete with existing microorganisms in the soil, and there is no evidence that microorganisms inoculated into the soil with IMO4 ever even survive the process of inoculation. Does that make sense? You put it out there. You have this little baby you've been bathing in your, even in a perfectly tendered area in the farm, and you have your tarps over it and all that stuff, and you're bathing the microorganisms, and you put it out. And the second you put that thing out there, those little babies, they get eaten up by all the sharks, man. It's just competition. And so it's crazy that I had to do research to say that was going to be, and he's laughing because it's the fungi people, I love them. Of course, it's never going to compete with what you currently have. And so, do I have any other points before I get to the conclusion? IMO4 cannot compete. It was concluded that the effect that farmers see in the addition of IMO4 was likely due to the increase of organic matter and plant available sugars, possibly the increase of porosity and decreased soil density that results from the high lignin content that's going into the material. So in a nutshell, if you put out high lignin material, you'll probably have a much better effect. And so, again, it's just a wrap up of, I don't want to say don't get wrapped up into the snake oil situations, but really understand how soil dynamics works and how competition and all these things work when you start babying materials or getting them from pretty much an unnatural source. And even in this case, it's a natural source, but you're just changing the environment of those microorganisms. You take a microorganism from down the hill over there, and or a sample down the hill and the sample over here, there's completely different microorganisms, especially from a soil perspective. Let's do questions at the end. Okay?
I was just curious if you're talking about a field application, would that be different, or would the microorganisms survive differently, like in
so I did it in containers.
environment?
I did it in containers, and I did it in field application as
Same
well.
thing.
Yeah. And unless I sterilized the soil, which I did do, and I found out that it was because of the organic matter, because of the sterilized soil. So I sterilized the media and the soil, and I had a control of completely sterilized material.
And got relatively similar.
Well, I got my control, which I did leaf analysis and then understood, because I use corn because it's very easy to get analysis on corn. And I did leaf analysis and leaf size and all these other analysis to find out if it affected the health of the plant.
And what was the finding in comparison, or you're saying it's the same, both sides?
It's essentially sterilized material is just as effective as unsterilized material. So, some other findings that I had from 4 years of dealing with this industry that were not in this book. The technique of using KNF, I'll call it KNF systems, Korean natural farming, using these systems with ungulate and fowl, they have a whole protocol for housing and storing fowl and pigs and ungulates in pens that are 4 feet deep with layered layers of organic matter, specific organic matter, logs, wood, inoculation of different microorganisms, and then these animals are placed on top of this. They put fungi in there for the pigs to eat, which comes up in fruiting bodies right there in their pen. It's a really, really great dynamic system, and actually this system, if you research it, could change and completely alter the way we look at animal production in this because I've seen these systems on a large scale producing 5,000 sow and producing 1 million chickens. And these are systems that require nobody cleaning out any poop out of pens. It doesn't require hosing off and runoff. All the runoff is all sustained within a controlled system. So I highly recommend you looking into that side of the Korean natural farming recommendations. If you plan on having fowl or ungulates, it's a great system, highly recommended. Who knows what fish amino acid is in their recommendation? It's the fermentation of fish with sugar. And then lactic acid bacteria solution, which is the fermentation of milk to attain lactic acid bacteria to use in application. I'll go out and say it. This is an excellent plant available nutrient. Its inoculants are economical and increase plant health and establish beneficial microorganisms on every application I see. And now we're starting to talk about in cannabis as well. Okay. Lactic acid bacteria, definitely. I utilize this in large-scale cannabis production. On a large scale, I make 55-gallon drums of this times 3 on a monthly basis, so that I could use it to get rid of algae in my environment. And it's basically like similar to EM, but I make it from a couple jugs of milk and one culture, and I bring it over on a larger scale. I don't want to get it on my flowers. I will fail testing if I get that on my flowers. You got to watch your high coliform levels if you're using anything like this. But fish amino acid in the root zone of especially hydroponic cannabis systems, if you filter that correctly, it's great stuff. Fermented seawater. They take seawater and they add sugar, and then they put it beneath the plants. It's actually highly, highly effective for mineralates. And so if you're pulling minerals out of the ocean and you're making it so that the plant can uptake those minerals very, very quickly with sugars and the fermentation of microorganisms that already exist in there, great technique. Water-soluble calcium, which is using vinegar to break down shells or bone. If you want to make it, it works. Go get some CalMag and go on for another day if you're on large-scale cannabis production, or something like that. Fermented plant juices, the art of taking your plant and then fermenting the plant material to harvest its nutrients or hormones from the plant tissue, and then applying it back onto the plant after it's been safely fermented. That is effective, but not for the ways that they explain. It's because you're putting sugar on a plant. It works pretty good. So if you want to go through all the steps, you could just put sugar on your plant. But in the nutshell, FAA, the fish amino acid, I find is the only KNF amendment that is a viable tool for commercial farmers, provided that there's a fish source that is safe. When I say safe, a heavy metals. I'll watch out for that. And then the infrastructure that's put in place for large-scale production. But if you have that much resources, you should just make a fish hydroslate production area and make fish hydroslate because it's cheaper and you'll get more out of it. So it just kind of squashed that whole FAA thing for you, but on a larger scale, right? That's if you're in the, at least 20,000 square foot canopy. Again, I'm from California and large scale, right? What is that? Pretty much only backyard gardeners regularly see an effect in applications of Korean natural farming, and there's little to no commercial applicability, and that's what I found. I'll kind of skip over this. Well, maybe not. Essentially, there's a whole lot of snake oil out there, which is the takeaway from this conversation. This is kind of my story of what I did to find the answer. And so I want you to question everything anyone tells you. when it comes to what comes down to, this is a magic tool for plant production. If anything they throw at you, just understand that there's likely going to be some variability. There's going to be some factors, and there is no cure-all, be-all for plant production when it comes to these types of systems. And even when you talk about bottled fertilizers and all these other things that you use in hydroponics and all that, really the only way to excel and actually do well with this is understand plant chemistry, plant morphology, physiology, relationships to its media. How does a plant do what it does for you to give you the thing that you want? And when we talk about cannabis, how does a plant produce high quality, AAA, beautiful cannabis buds, right? How do you get to that point? How do you get to the point where you're producing the best, either for yourself, for your needs, or for a market? Okay? So then, that was my master's. So after I did this, I served as the first professor at University of Hawaii who didn't have a PhD because of my understanding of microorganisms and my ability to take on the man in those political environments. And so I served time there teaching sustainable agriculture to students. So those that were fortunate enough to see my classes, they learned a lot of stuff in there. And if you can understand the type of person that generally takes a sustainable agriculture class at the University of Hawaii, Hilo, is very familiar with my industry. And so there was a lot of information that was learned for a very good price for those students. But at the same time, while I was doing that, the state of Hawaii allowed for licensing of cannabis production to retail companies. And so during this time, at the same time, I was basically compiling executive management teams and investors and pharmacists to apply for one of the 8 licenses in Hawaii. And these are vertically integrated companies, so we're actually not even really allowed to talk to each other in a sense. We're kind of like petri dishes on our own. We are retail and production, everything in-house. And so it was an interesting application process, but after about a year of working like 20 hours a week on it, we put in the application and we ended up getting a license. So we ended up getting a license on Big Island of Hawaii with me and my team, mainly because of my understanding of who pulled the strings in Hawaiian agriculture, who pulls the strings in medical standards, which is pharmacies, who pulls the strings from adaptation, and that's academia. So I brought up several people together that kind of hit those points, and we ended up getting a license. And so we ended up becoming Laola, which is now Big Island Grown, which is on the Big Island of Hawaii. We were the only ones open for a little while, but I think the ethos just opened up. So we have 3 retail locations out there, Hilo, Kona, and Waimea. And then we also constructed a 40,000 square foot triple enveloped facility. If you could imagine, like I said, producing cannabis in Hawaii is a very difficult thing to do from an integrated pest management standpoint. And the state said at first we're not allowed to do outdoor systems, and we're all like, oh, what? Well, everybody else is like, oh, and I'm like, yay, because there's no way to produce safe outdoor cannabis in Hawaii. When you talk about with testing and regulations that they have to parts per billion for a lot of the pesticides, so you can't even spray anything on plants as the regulation stands in Hawaii. Almost nothing. So we built a 40,000 square foot facility, triple envelope, meaning positive pressure on the inside chamber where the grows are. There's an outer chamber that the positive pressure bleeds into, and then that is held by a steel shell, which is on the outside, which also holds a little bit more positive pressure than it. So nothing can get inside. Really great air quality standards. If you could imagine, it's a really clean environment. It's basically like a spaceship that just landed in the jungle, and it's in Papaikou on the north side of the Big Island. If you get High Times magazine, last month in October we were featured, so you can check out what we're doing out there and the high quality cannabis we're producing. So I got into that, but then I got hit by the ownership bug with what I'd been doing in cannabis, and then working with this dispensary, and then the fact that the state put a regulation that says that I can't work for another company, nor that I want to, being an owner, right? So I had to break out of Hawaii, and then started doing other cannabis operations kind of worldwide. So I'm working with groups in Canada, and I'm working with a group in Michigan. Everybody knows Special Blends? Special Blends, Clio. And then is anybody familiar with Massive Creations out of NorCal? This is Shiloh Massive. This is from Third Gen Group, and this is probably one of the most influential, if not appreciated breeders in Northern California. And so we're going to be bringing his genetics out here as well. So working on a genetics laboratory for pheno hunting. The new game, if anybody wants to know what the new game is, genetic markers of cannabis as it pertains to identified strains, and getting into understanding what is the chemotype, the genetic markers and fingerprint of that cannabis, and then getting those, the people that are claiming those to be their own, as close to patentable as you could possibly get it, there's certain ways to do it, but literally at the door, they're all at the door right now of the patent office, waiting to bang the door down because they have Provence, which, I've won 4 cannabis cups for this strain over the last 10 years. Of course it's your strain. Nobody's going to doubt it's your strain. You're the one who made it. Nobody doubts you're the one who made it. Plus I have the genetic markers, and I have all these other things done, and then they're standing at the gates waiting for that to open. That's where it's at right now. So I'm chasing the pheno hunting game on the genetic marker testing. And then there's I do writing. Everybody familiar with this book? Who hasn't read this book? Really? Oh, Ed will be very happy. This is Ed Rosenthal's Marijuana Grower's Handbook. This is pretty much in every single grower's library. I'm working with Ed to rewrite this book, and we are going to bring it to the 22nd century, and we are going to make it much more usable as a tool of reference for cannabis growers, starting from 1 plant to about 100 lights. So we're going to bring it up a notch. Knowing that the industry is now standard for us is 10,000 square feet is a small grow. California right now hands out micro business licenses for mom and pop shops to pay their bills is 10,000 square feet. That's a small grow. So we're trying to adapt this book to be a little bit more intuitive of where cannabis is growing. Thanks for your time, everybody.